Walking home was like walking through a waterfront cemetery. New Orleans wasn't the same, not after Hurricane Katrina. The streets were still covered in mud, debris piled high on the sidewalks, and the smell of decay filled the air. I knew I shouldn't be here, that there was nothing to recover, but something inside me kept pushing me back. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear. My house was at the end of a narrow street, with gnarled oak trees that seemed to be waiting for me to come. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, and my feet sank into the wet mud of the yard. I walked up the steps to the porch, hesitating for a moment before turning the handle. The door swung open with a dry click. The smell of mildew and soggy wood made me gag. The kitchen was in ruins, broken dishes, cabinets ripped from the walls, water stains staining everything. The ceiling had caved in places, and the floor creaked under my weight. I climbed the stairs cautiously, dodging the debris, feeling the rotten wood creak with each step. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from the hallway, a whisper, faint as an echo carried by the wind. My heart raced. Sarah, I swallowed hard. It was impossible. My mother had died in the storm, swept away by the current as she tried to reach me. I had seen it with my own eyes, but there was her voice, calling out to me. The door to her room was ajar. Breathing hard, I pushed it open slowly, feeling the cold spread through my body. The room was destroyed. The bed had fallen over. The furniture had been overturned. The curtains were torn as if someone had been fighting inside. But what made me stop was the mirror on the dressing table. The glass was cracked in strange patterns, like roots spreading across the reflection. I took a step forward. My own eyes stared back at me from the other side, but something seemed wrong. The image was delayed. My head was moving, but my reflection was taking a second longer to catch up. I pressed my lips together, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia. I touched the cool glass, and a shiver ran down my spine. Then I saw it. Behind me in the reflection, a dark silhouette formed in the dim light. Tall, thin, with long, gnarled arms. Sharp, claw-like fingers rested on my shoulder. I turned with a start. The room was empty. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked back at the mirror, and the silhouette was still there, closer now. The silence was broken by a dull thud in the hallway. Something fell. I turned toward the sound and saw a picture frame on the floor. The frame was cracked, but the glass was intact. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was an old photo of me and my mother, sitting on the porch of our house. But something was wrong. My mother wasn't smiling like I remembered. Her eyes were dark, empty, and now they were looking directly at me. A gust of wind blew through the room, but the windows were closed. The mirror creaked, as if it were about to shatter. I felt a cold chill run up the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. My fingers gripped the frame tightly, the cold glass pressing against my skin. My mother's gaze in the photo seemed more intense, as if she were trying to tell me something. My breathing became heavy, and a knot tightened in my stomach. Then I heard it again. Sarah. The whisper came from the mirror. My muscles locked. My reflection was still there, but there was something wrong with it. Its eyes were too wide, and its expression wasn't mine. A sharp crack echoed through the room. The moonlight streaming through the window wavered for a moment, and I felt a sudden chill engulf me, as if the air itself had become heavy, suffocating. I took a step back, my knees almost giving way. The reflection in the mirror didn't follow me. My lungs stopped. My heart hammered in my chest as if it wanted to escape. Then the mirror moved. Not my reflection. The glass itself trembled, as if something inside it was trying to break free. The cracks slowly widened, like veins spreading through dead skin. Sarah! The voice was clearer now, more real. I knew I should run. Every instinct inside me screamed to get out of here, but my legs were rooted to the spot. My eyes locked on the mirror as the shadow inside it began to take shape. It was my mother, or something that looked like her. Her eyes were dark holes, her skin pale as if she'd spent years submerged in water. Her mouth opened, but there were no teeth, just endless emptiness. My lips parted in a silent scream. Then the mirror shattered. Shards flew across the room, and I fell backward, hitting the floor hard. The air was knocked from my lungs, but I tried to crawl away anyway. The room seemed to grow darker, as if the shadows had become solid. Suddenly, I felt cold hands around my ankles. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was too strong. "Mommy!" I screamed without knowing why. The shadow that had been inside the mirror now stood before me, taking shape. Its face was indistinct. Its eyes were just dark holes that absorbed all the light in the room. "You left me." The voice was weak, like a whisper in water. My nails dug into the floor, trying to hold on. I tried. My voice trailed off, terror choking my words. The shadow leaned over me, its icy presence enveloping me completely. My body shook, my mind screaming for me to wake up from this nightmare. Then the bedroom door slammed shut, and a sharp wind rushed through me. The grip on my ankles disappeared. Crawling, I backed away to the corner of the room, my chest rising and falling in despair. The shadow retreated into the broken mirror, its form dissolving like mist. The room returned to silence. My breathing was erratic. My body was drenched in cold sweat. The mirror now reflected only an empty room, but I knew it was still there. I wasn't free. I never would be. The water hadn't completely receded when I returned to my home in New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina had taken almost everything: houses, streets, lives. But it hadn't taken the music. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. My grandmother always said that music was a bridge between worlds, an echo that never fades. Maybe that's why I could still hear her singing, even after everything. When I parked my car on the potholed street, night had already fallen. The houses around me were in ruins, some completely abandoned, others covered with boards, as if to protect themselves from another disaster. My house was still standing, but barely recognizable. The roof had caved in places, the windows were broken, and the porch had sunk in on one side. I went inside anyway. The smell of wet wood and mold hit me immediately. I climbed the stairs, dodging debris, and went straight to what had once been my grandmother's bedroom. That was where I heard her sing the most. The bed was overturned. The furniture was rotting, but the old gramophone was still on the dresser, the same one she used to play her old blues records. I walked closer, running my fingers over the wood, darkened by humidity. Then I heard it, low, drawn out, as if it were coming from the walls. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word." My heart almost stopped. I knew that voice. It was my grandmother's voice. I spun on my heels, my chest rising and falling too fast. The room was empty. Moonlight streamed in through the broken window, casting long shadows on the damp wooden floor. Then the gramophone spun on its own. The scratched record crackled before the music started. But it wasn't a recording. It was her singing. My throat went dry. The air in the room grew heavy, as if something invisible was there with me. "Nana?" My voice was shaky. The music stopped abruptly. The silence was overwhelming. Then a whisper. "You came back." The air froze in my lungs. My eyes darted around the room, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The wood creaked behind me. Goosebumps crawled all over my skin. I turned slowly and saw it. In the old mirror next to the bed, the image reflected was not mine. It was hers. My grandmother was there, looking at me, but her face was not as I remembered. Her skin was gray, her eyes sunken, dull. Her blue dress was soaked, as if she were still trapped in the storm. "You shouldn't have come back." Her mouth moved, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere. I took a step back, my body paralyzed by fear. The gramophone spun again, but now, instead of soft music, what came out was a distorted sound, a scream. My reflection trembled in the mirror, and her image began to change. Her eyes became black holes, her mouth opened too wide, impossible, bottomless. The light flickered, The mirror cracked, and then the entire room shook. I felt the floor move beneath my feet, and a cold wind filled the room. The curtains rose, the furniture creaked, and the gramophone fell to the floor with a crash. And, in the midst of the chaos, I heard it. "You have to sing, or you'll never get out of here." My heart was beating so hard it hurt. Her voice grew louder, closer, as if it were inside my head. And then I felt it. Cold hands landed on my shoulders. The room spun. The darkness swallowed me. The darkness was thick, suffocating, as if I had been thrown into deep water without knowing how to swim. My lungs burned, and my heart pounded in a frantic rhythm. Then a melody began to form around me. Low, hoarse, distorted. The lullaby. The cold hands on my shoulders tightened. My muscles tensed, but I couldn't move. I was trapped. My grandmother's voice echoed through the void. "You have to sing." My throat was dry. My hands were shaking. "Nana, My voice came out hoarse, barely audible. "Now." The order came with a cold whisper against the back of my neck. I tried. My voice cracked on the first try, but I knew I had no choice. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word." The air trembled around me. The grip of her cold hands loosened slightly. I continued. "Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." The emptiness around me slowly dissolved, shadows drifting away like mist being pushed by the wind. My legs began to loosen, my vision clearing. But then, her voice changed. "Sing louder." My lungs felt compressed, as if something invisible was squeezing my chest. "And if that mockingbird won't sing." The darkness split with a deafening crash. My body was thrown backwards, and suddenly, I was back in the room. But I wasn't alone. My grandmother stood there, in the middle of the destroyed room, the dim light of the moon reflecting off her damp, darkened skin. Her mouth moved soundlessly, her eyes sunken like bottomless wells. The gramophone spun on its own, creaking as if it were stuck in an endless loop. The reflection in the shattered mirror wasn't mine. It was hers. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. She came closer, with each step a wet, sticky sound, as if she were walking through mud. "You've come home." Her voice was now an echo layered on top of each other, multiple layers of something that didn't belong in this world. My throat tightened. I came to say goodbye." She stopped. Her empty eyes flickered for a moment, as if something inside her still recognized me. "Goodbye." The mirror behind her began to vibrate, the cracked surface distorting like a moving lake. The lullaby still played in the background, but now it was slow, drawn out, fading into the air like a last breath of life. Then her eyes met mine, one last time, and she disappeared. The gramophone stopped. The mirror shattered completely, falling to the floor in pieces. The room fell silent. My chest heaved in despair, sweat dripping down my face. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where my grandmother had been. But I knew one thing. She was no longer trapped there. I picked up the gramophone, now inert, and left the room. The night outside was cold, but the air felt lighter, as if something had finally found rest. As I walked down the destroyed street, a gentle wind blew against me, and in the background, almost imperceptibly, I heard it. One last song. I returned to Pass Christian, Mississippi, 5 months after Katrina. The town still looked like a graveyard, full of destroyed houses, boats stranded where they shouldn't be, and the smell of rotting wood mixed with something I couldn't identify. The devastation had been so bad that the streets I knew no longer existed, but there was one thing that remained the same. The lighthouse. The solitary white structure still stood, defying the sea and the wind, as if the hurricane had never passed by. I parked the car near the beach, adjusted my cap on my head, and went out, breathing in the salty smell of the ocean. I shouldn't be there. I knew it well, but the lighthouse called to me in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it was because my grandfather worked there when I was a child. He always said that lighthouses were eyes open to the sea, watching everything that came and went. The night before the storm, he told me about a man who, he said, lived in the lighthouse. When the waters rise, he walks, my grandfather had said, his gaze lost on the horizon. I laughed at the time, thinking it was just another fisherman's tale. But now, with the lighthouse there, lonely and imposing, I wondered if it really was just a tale to scare children. The iron gate creaked in the wind as I walked to the base of the building. The door was open, not broken or broken, just ajar, as if someone was waiting for me. I went inside. The smell of sea air and rust filled my nostrils. The interior was dark, and the metal staircase spiraled up to the top. My footsteps echoed through the empty space as I climbed, each step creaking under my weight. The feeling of being watched grew with each flight of stairs. When I reached the lantern room, a cold wind blew through the space, even with all the windows closed. Then I saw it. In the reflection of the lantern's glass, someone was behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun on my heels. Nothing. The space was empty, just silence and the dim light flickering above my head. I looked back at the glass, and there he was, a tall, thin figure, hunched over like a dry twig. His skin was dark and damp, his eyes sunken and bright, like those of an animal on the prowl. But the worst thing was the smell. It was strong, suffocating, a mixture of salt and rotting flesh. The man with the lighthouse. My grandfather wasn't making this up. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My lungs seemed incapable of drawing in air, as if the very environment had turned liquid around me. The reflection moved, but not just in the glass. Behind me, the sound of wet feet stepping on the metal floor. My entire body shivered. Then, a guttural voice, coming from somewhere between the wind and the crashing waves outside. "Did you come back to see?" My lips parted, but no sound came out. The footsteps came closer. In the reflection, he was closer now. His mouth opened, but it wasn't a normal mouth. It was a dark, endless hole, a void where the air seemed to be sucked out. "Don't look," the voice whispered. But I looked, and that was when everything went black. The world around me went black. Not pitch black, but black, solid, absolute. It was as if I had been torn from reality and thrown into the void. My body felt like it was floating, but at the same time, I felt something pulling me down. The smell of the sea was now unbearable. Then, a dim light flickered in front of me. The lighthouse. But it wasn't where it should have been. The structure seemed distorted, tilted, as if it were sinking into the water. Waves crashed against its walls, and with each flash of the lantern at the top, I saw things in the ocean. Silhouettes moving, pale arms sticking out of the water, eyes glowing in the darkness. And then, I saw him. The lighthouse man was there, standing between me and the light. He seemed bigger now, his dark, waterlogged skin glistening in the intermittent glow of the lighthouse. His eyes were two empty caverns, and his mouth. There was no bottom to his mouth. It was a black hole, a vacuum where the air seemed to be sucked in. "You looked." His voice came not from his mouth, but from the very space around us, like the echo of waves crashing against the rocks. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. "You are part of this now." My feet were wet. I looked down. The water was rising, covering my ankles, then my knees. But this was no ordinary water. It was thick, sticky, and every time I tried to move, I felt something wrapping around me, pulling me under. The voices began to whisper. "Sink. Join us. The sea takes everything." I forced my body to move, to fight it, but it was useless. The lighthouse man approached, and the smell of rotting flesh washed over me like a choking wave. "Did you see?" he repeated, his mouth widening. The lighthouse blinked again, and for a second, I saw something inside it. Faces, hundreds of them. Lost people. People who, like me, had looked. And then, a hand grabbed my wrist. Not his. It was strong, warm, unlike the suffocating cold around me. I was pulled back hard, and suddenly, The emptiness disappeared. My eyes flew open, and I was back, lying on the beach. The weak morning sun touched my face. The lighthouse was still there, standing firm, intact. But I wasn't alone. My grandfather was standing beside me. The problem was, he had died years before. He was looking at me with that same serene gaze as always, his hands in the pockets of the old navy blue coat he wore on cold days. "I warned you," he said, shaking his head. "Never look." I tried to speak, but before I could say anything, he began to disappear, like mist dissolving into the air. Then I heard one last thing, the sound of wet footsteps coming from the lighthouse. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. I always thought they were just exaggerations, legends created to scare children and keep adults away from abandoned places. But that night, everything changed. The house I had bought in the Louisiana countryside seemed too perfect to be true. Big, spacious, and for such a low price that even the real estate agent hesitated before handing me the keys. The neighbors avoided talking about the place's past. They just said it was better left empty. But I've never been one to believe in superstitions. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. The house was old, full of strange creaks and cracks, but nothing out of the ordinary. But then the sleepless nights began. The first time I heard the footsteps was around 2 in the morning. I was downstairs, reading on the couch, when a soft sound, like a dress rustling against the hardwood floor, echoed in the upstairs hallway. I stood still, listening. Nothing. I thought it was my imagination and went back to my book. But then the footsteps continued. I took the flashlight with me as I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The hallway was dark, the faint moonlight streaming in through the window at the end of the hall. All the doors were closed, except one, the one to the master bedroom. My heart pounded as I approached. As I pushed open the door, the light from the flashlight illuminated the empty room. The floor was covered in dust, the curtains fluttering slightly in the night breeze. But then I saw the mirror, and there, standing in front of it, was she, a woman dressed as a bride. Her dress was old, yellowed with age, and her veil covered her face, giving her an ethereal appearance, as if she were made of mist. She held a bouquet of dried, wilted flowers, her hands trembling slightly. My blood ran cold. I should have run, but I couldn't. "Who's there?" My voice was low, almost a whisper. She didn't turn around right away. She just tilted her head slightly to the side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, she turned. The veil lifted slightly in the breeze, revealing an incomplete face. Parts of it were there, but others seemed absent, as if someone had erased its existence, leaving only fragments of what had once been a human face. Its eyes were black, empty holes, sucking in all the light around it. The air grew heavy. My chest tightened. She took a step forward. The mirror behind her trembled. Cracks began to spread, like spider webs stretching across the glass. Something dark was moving within the reflection. "He promised." Her voice was an echo, a whisper filled with sadness and anger. My vision went black for a moment, as if I were about to pass out. I tried to move, but my feet were glued to the floor. The mirror exploded. Shards flew across the room, and I fell backward, falling against the doorframe. When I looked up, the woman was gone. The room was empty again, but the cold remained. Panting, I ran out of the house, stumbling down the porch steps, and that's when I saw it. A gravestone forgotten by time, nestled among the weeds. The name engraved on it was unfamiliar to me, but the date made me shiver inside. She had died on her own wedding day, and now she was still waiting for her groom. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, that it was all just a delusion brought on by fatigue and the stories whispered by my neighbors. But the cold wind against my skin and the dampness of the night assured me that it was real. The headstone in front of me was covered in moss, the letters worn away by time. I knelt down, running my fingers over the cool stone. The name engraved there was Margaret Delacroix. I had never heard of her, but the date made me catch my breath. November 13th, 1874, on the day of her own wedding. A shiver ran down my spine, and the feeling of being watched returned. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was only the dark house, the windows reflecting the moonlight like empty eyes. I had to get out of here. I hurried up the porch steps, trying to ignore the fact that my hands were still shaking. I went inside and locked the door behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to control my heartbeat, but then I heard it, inside, low, distant, as if it were coming from another time. Music, the waltz, it was playing again. I swallowed hard. I didn't have a record player or a radio on, but the music continued, echoing through the halls, as if the walls were singing to me. My legs moved on their own, guiding me down the hallway and into the ballroom. The dim moonlight illuminated the wooden floor scratched by time. In the center of the room, dust and shadows danced, as if they were trapped in an invisible waltz. Then, I felt the cold. Behind me, I turned on my heel, and there she was, the bride, standing in the middle of the ballroom, her veil fluttering slightly, her hands still holding the dead bouquet. The dress seemed to have gained color, as if the house itself was trying to recreate that night lost in time. But her eyes were still empty. He promised. Her voice was low, scratchy, as if she were trying to remember how to speak. My muscles tensed. "Who?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I would have liked. The music grew louder. She took a step forward. "He said he would come back." Her fingers tightened on the bouquet, and the dried petals fell like ash. "He swore he would never keep me waiting." The temperature dropped so low that my breath became visible. But he lied. The waltz ended with a long, distorted note, and then everything exploded. The windows shook, the house shuddered, the chandelier overhead swayed as if it were about to fall. The bride moved too quickly. In the blink of an eye, she was inches away from me. The veil fluttered, and I saw her face, or what was left of it. Her features were haggard, her skin pale and sunken, her eyes soulless, her lips parted, and inside her mouth there was only darkness. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to run. "You came in his place." Her voice broke into a mournful whisper. "Now, you'll have to stay." The house began to crumble. Furniture was thrown against the walls. The floor vibrated beneath my feet. A large mirror in the corner of the room split in half, reflecting dozens of writhing shadows. The bride raised her hand. I didn't feel her touch, but I felt my soul being pulled. An indescribable despair took over me, as if something invisible was ripping out every part of my essence. "No!" I screamed, struggling to move. Her veil fluttered in the wind, and something in her expression changed. A moment. That was all I got. I ran in the opposite direction, tripping over the debris and crashing through the front door. The cool night air hit me hard. Behind me, a loud crash shook the house. The icy wind blew hard, throwing dust and leaves around me. When I turned, the house was as it had been before, silent, dark, but I knew she was still inside, waiting, always waiting. When I returned to New Orleans after Katrina, I knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing could have prepared me for what it was. Volunteering for the rescue teams wasn't for everyone. The city was still choking with the smell of rotten water and bodies that were never found. Silence filled the streets, broken only by the sharp wind and the sounds of debris moving by itself. But the worst thing was the sky. It wasn't the same anymore. During the day, it was gray and lifeless, and at night, it spoke. The first time I heard the whispers was on the 5th night. I was patrolling a flooded area with 2 other volunteers, walking on makeshift planks to avoid falling into the contaminated water. The sound came from above softly, like an echo carried by the wind. It seemed far away, but at the same time, too close. I stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" I asked the others. They stared at me as if I were delirious. "Hear what?" one of them, Carson, asked, his brow furrowed. But before I could answer, the sound came again. Whispers. The words were indecipherable, but spoken with an urgent tone, like a warning from the sky itself. I looked up, and for an instant, I swear I saw something. Amidst the thick, dark clouds, a silhouette, tall, thin, like it was peering through the cracks of the universe itself. I blinked, and there was nothing. Fear prickled under my skin. "We should go," I muttered, but Carson laughed. "Relax, man, it's just the wind." But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. That night passed without incident, but the whispers came back, every night, and worse. They started getting closer. On the 10th night, I woke up with a suffocating sensation in my chest. The air was heavy. The tent where I slept seemed smaller, tighter, as if something invisible was trying to get in. I looked around. Everyone was still asleep, but the whispers were there. Low. Director. Now I could make out some words. "Don't look up." I swallowed hard. A cold breeze passed through the tent, making the canvas vibrate slightly. I closed my eyes tightly. "Don't look up." But curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The night was silent, too silent. My eyes rose to the sky, and then I saw it. Something was there, not among the clouds, but inside them, moving, watching. The whispers grew louder. He saw, he saw, he saw. My knees buckled. Fear gripped my body, but I couldn't stop staring. The thing up there moved faster, expanded, and then came the last word, clear, sharp: "Run." The world shook around me. The wind roared like a torn scream, and the sky came down on me. The wind hit me like a punch to the chest, knocking me backward. The sound around me was deafening, as if the sky itself were tearing itself apart. My eyes were still fixed on the thing. It moved within the clouds, its distorted form expanding, twisting like a black tide. Its contours were blurred, but the eyes, oh, the eyes were there, multiple, sunken, pupilless, and all of them fixed on me. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The whispers became voices, multiple, overlapping, speaking at once. Some pleaded, some laughed, some cried, and one of them called my name. Noah. My heart nearly stopped. My throat was dry. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. The silhouette within the clouds tilted slightly, and the air around me seemed to bend. Space distorted, and then I saw it. The shadows in the sky weren't just clouds. They were people. Bodies contorted, faces blanked out, mouths open in a silent scream, swallowed by the sky itself. My mind couldn't process it. My lungs burned, and then I heard it again. "Run!" My legs finally responded. I turned and sprinted into the camp. The wind whipped at my skin, and the whispers chased me. My footsteps were heavy in the soggy mud, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode. I stumbled and fell. The cold earth swallowed my hands, and I felt the sticky moisture cling to my skin. Behind me, the trees shook. The sky seemed lower. And then, silence. Just my ragged breathing. I forced myself to look back. The sky was normal. The dark clouds were still there, but now they seemed ordinary. The wind had died down. The voices were gone. My muscles shook as I tried to stand. My fingers dug into the ground, and I felt something hard beneath the mud. A cold, smooth surface. I pulled, and what came out of the earth chilled me to the bone. A nameplate, covered in dirt and rust, but still legible. Noah Calloway. The air rushed from my lungs. It was my name. I swallowed hard, brushing some more off the plate. The date was there. September 14th, 2005. The day after Hurricane Katrina. The blood ran cold in my veins. Did I die in that storm? My hands were shaking so much that the sign slipped from my fingers. Behind me, the whispers began again. Low, slurred. "He doesn't know yet." I closed my eyes and felt the sky open up. If I had known what was waiting for me that night, I would never have entered that cemetery. I had always heard stories about Stull Cemetery. The place was known as one of the 7 gateways to hell, but until then, they were just legends. Or at least that's what I thought. The idea seemed simple. My friend Ryan insisted that spending the night in Stull Cemetery would just be a joke. I didn't want to go, but when you're 18 and your friends dare you, you accept. So, at 11:45 p.m., we were there, in the cursed cemetery, and the gates were already open. The place was small, but it seemed bigger in the dark. Crooked tombstones, graves covered in weeds, and, in the center, a ruined church. The locals said that the devil himself appeared there on Halloween night, but this wasn't Halloween night. It was just any old Friday, or at least, it should have been. Ryan was excited. He said it was all nonsense. If the devil shows up here, where is he? His laughter echoed through the cemetery. The sound gave me chills. But then, the wind stopped. There was absolute silence. The leaves stopped moving. Not a single cricket chirping. Nothing. Ryan looked at me. His smile disappeared. That's when we heard it. Low, shuffling, footsteps, coming from inside the ruined church. Ryan shined his flashlight. The beam of light danced around the inside of the church. Old broken chairs, a fallen altar table, but nothing else. "It's just the wind," he muttered, but there was no wind. And then, something moved. My breath caught. In the darkest corner of the church, a shadow rose from the ground, tall, skeletal, and its eyes glowed like fire. Ryan stepped back. The flashlight shook in his hand. The thing didn't move. It slithered, and suddenly, the whispers began, low, quick, in a language I didn't understand. And then, the church door slammed shut by itself. Ryan screamed. We ran back to the gate, but it was closed, locked. It wasn't like this before. Ryan pulled at the bars, but they wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it, right behind me, a low voice, cold, whispering in my ear, "You shouldn't be here." I froze. Ryan stared at me with wide eyes. "What is it?" I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, but he didn't need an answer, because the whisper came again, this time louder, and it wasn't behind me anymore. It was inside my head. The flashlight went out. The cemetery plunged into total darkness. Ryan pulled desperately on the gate, but I couldn't move, because I could feel it. I could feel something approaching. I could feel his eyes on me, and then a cold hand touched my shoulder. The hand was as cold as death. The long, thin fingers pressed against my shoulder. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. And then the whisper came again, this time inside my head. "Stay." Ryan was still pulling on the gate, but I couldn't move a muscle. All I could feel was that presence behind me, the cold breath on my neck, the fingers digging into my shoulder. Then, slowly, I turned my head and saw. The thing had no face. The skin was pale and stretched as if it had never had eyes, a nose, or a mouth. But somehow I knew it saw me, and then it smiled, not with a mouth, but with skin tearing in half, a horrible gash splitting open from ear to ear. And then he spoke. "Did you bring me another one?" The voice didn't come out of his open mouth. It echoed inside my mind. My vision went black. My body shook. And then I heard a snap. Ryan. I had managed to open the gate. "Run!" That scream pulled me back. My muscles responded. I ran. I threw myself out of the cemetery. Ryan fell beside me. The gate slammed shut behind us. A deafening thud. We lay there on the ground, breathing hard. The silence was absolute, and when I looked back, the cemetery was empty. The ruined church looked different. The headstones were no longer crooked. The wind started to blow again. It was like nothing had happened. But then Ryan picked up the flashlight from the ground, and his face went pale. He pointed it at me, at my shoulder. I looked, and my blood ran cold. There were finger marks, 5 black marks, deep into my skin, and next to them, a name, written in ash, Ryan. We didn't say anything. We couldn't. We just got in the car and drove away. The road seemed darker, the stars farther away. The engine roared, but the silence inside the car was suffocating. And then, Ryan looked in the rearview mirror and screamed. I turned around. On the side of the road, the silhouette was there, standing, watching, eyes glowing like fire. And then, she raised her hand and pointed at Ryan. I stepped on the gas. The road disappeared beneath the wheels. But when I looked again, he was still there. No matter how fast we drove, he was always there, standing, waiting. Because now, Ryan belonged to him. And somehow, so did I. We never went back to Stull Cemetery. We never spoke of that night again. But the years passed, and every Friday, at 11:45 p.m., my phone rings. The number is always unknown, and when I answer, a voice whispers, cold and drawn out, "Did you bring me another one?" If there's one thing I've learned from driving the Kansas highways late at night, it's that some things just don't make sense, and some people shouldn't be there. It was around 2 a.m. when I got on K15. The road was deserted, no cars, no lights, nothing but dark asphalt cutting through the endless fields around us. The radio was just a hiss, and the silence was so deep that I started to feel a heaviness in the air. After driving for almost an hour, I saw something up ahead, a white shadow, on the shoulder, stopped. I blinked a few times, but she was still there, a woman wearing a long white dress, pale skin, still motionless, dark hair falling over her shoulders. And then, she raised her hand. Hitchhiking. My stomach churned. She shouldn't be here. The nearest town was miles away. There were no abandoned cars, nothing to indicate how she got there. And yet, she was waiting for me. I slowed down. I approached slowly. The headlights bathed her face, and then I realized she didn't blink. Her eyes were sunken, and her smile, it was wrong. My chest tightened. I should have kept going, but before I could react, she was already at the passenger window. I didn't see her move. I didn't see her walk. She was just there, skin too white, hands too thin, her dress slightly wet, as if she'd just stepped out of a river. She smiled, a slow, cold smile, and then she spoke, low, in a weak, scratchy voice. "Can you take me?" Every instinct in my body screamed to get out of there, but my hand was already on the door handle, as if something was pulling me. And then, I unlocked the car. She got in slowly. She closed the door without making a sound. The air inside the car grew colder. My chest felt heavy, and for some reason, I couldn't look directly at her. "Where are you going?" My voice came out low, shaky. It took her a few seconds to answer, and then she whispered, "Home." The radio crackled. The road seemed darker. The clock on the dashboard blinked. 2:23 a.m., and with every mile I drove, her silence grew more suffocating. Then something happened, something that made me freeze. In the rearview mirror, I saw her feet, and they were not touching the ground. My heart raced. She knew I had seen her, because she slowly turned her face away. Her eyes were now black, and her smile was growing. My throat went dry. I wanted to ask who she was, but then she whispered, "You know who I am." The streetlights flickered. The radio exploded in static, and then she raised a hand, slowly, with long, cold fingers, and touched my arm. My whole body shook, my skin burned, and a memory I didn't have flashed through my mind. A dark road, a woman in white, running along the shoulder, a car coming at me fast, blinding headlights, and then, the impact. I blinked hard. My eyes returned to the road. The car was still moving, but she wasn't there anymore. The passenger seat was empty. The seatbelt was still buckled, but there was no one there. My chest rose and fell rapidly. Sweat dripped down my forehead. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was deserted, or at least, that's what I thought, because there, on the shoulder, storied, waiting, she was still there. And then, slowly, she raised her hand, hitchhiking. Again, she was still there, in the same place, on the same deserted shoulder, as if nothing had happened, as if I had never stopped. But I knew she had been inside my car before, and now, she wanted me to stop again. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. My hands were shaking. The road seemed to stretch out in front of me. The headlights illuminated the worn asphalt, but something inside me kept me from stepping on the gas. She didn't move. She didn't wave. She didn't take a single step. She just watched me. And then, she smiled. My muscles locked. I had to get out of there. My feet reacted before my mind. I stepped on the gas. The car roared, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The road flashed before my eyes. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, it was gone. Just the darkness behind me, the empty shoulder, the heavy silence. But then, something changed. The passenger seat creaked, as if someone was moving. The air turned cold. My breath caught in my throat. And then, a soft, scratchy voice whispered beside me. "Why didn't you take me home?" I screamed. My arms tightened on the steering wheel. The car skidded on the road. The wheels screeched. The headlights illuminated the desolate fields. And then, everything went dark. I woke up to the strong smell of wet earth. The sound of the engine still buzzed in my head. The road was silent. The car, it was in the middle of a field. The doors were unlocked, and the passenger seat, empty. I crawled out, dizzy, panting. The wind blew hard, shaking the tall grass. I looked around. Nothing. No one. Until, in the middle of the road, I saw it. Wet footprints, following where my car had left the road and stopping right next to the passenger. Fear choked me. This couldn't be happening. I looked at my hands, sweaty, trembling. But then, I noticed something on my arm. A fingerprint. 5 darkened prints. Cold, as if something had held me back at the moment of the accident. And that's when I heard it. Faint, far away, but still there. The sound of footsteps on the road. Coming, towards me. I didn't wait. I got into the car desperately. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine didn't start. Again and again. Sweat was running down my face. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, she was behind the car, and this time, she wasn't smiling. Her face was pale and empty. Her eyes were as black as the asphalt. Her dress was wet and torn, and she was getting closer, slowly, unhurriedly, as if she knew I couldn't escape. My vision went black. My breath was short. And then, the car started on its own. The engine roared. I didn't think. I just accelerated. The road disappeared behind me. The speedometer went up. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see. But I knew she was still there. I knew this wasn't over. And then, my radio crackled. The electricity inside the car flickered, and a voice, her voice, it echoed inside the car, low, almost gentle, but cold as death. "I'm still here." I didn't believe in ghosts, but after that night, I never doubted it again. Sour Castle has always been a mystery to me, an old, isolated mansion, hidden behind rusty bars. Ever since I was a child, I'd heard stories about voices in the hallways, laughter without origin, and windows that closed by themselves. But I never thought I'd go inside one day. It was Daniel's idea. "Let's spend a night at Sour Castle," he said excitedly. "It's just an old house, nothing special." But I had felt something wrong from the start, and that night, I should have trusted my intuition. We climbed over the fence in the back. The moon illuminated the mansion's facade. The tall windows reflected a deep darkness, like empty eyes. The silence was absolute. The city was too far away for us to hear cars, voices. We were alone. or so we thought. The front door was open, dark wood, creaking in the wind. I hesitated. Daniel smiled. "Come on, you wimp." And he walked in without looking back. The air inside the mansion was heavy. The smell of rotting wood and dust choked the lungs. The floor creaked under every step. The walls had faded paint, full of cracks, and the stairs went to a second floor where the darkness seemed denser. "This is incredible," Daniel murmured in awe. I couldn't answer, because at that moment I heard the first sound, low, shuffled, like someone was breathing too close. My chest tightened. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Daniel laughed. "Stop being paranoid." But then, something moved at the top of the stairs, a quick shadow, fleeting, as if someone was watching us. Daniel shone his flashlight. "Nothing." "Wind," he said. But there were no open windows, and there was no wind. We explored the first floor. Old furniture covered in sheets, a dusty piano, and an old clock. That started ticking by itself. 3 chimes, and then silence. Daniel froze. It was just time, right? But I knew. That clock hadn't worked in decades. We went into the kitchen, shattered glasses on the floor. A chair had tipped over, and, in the center of the table, a porcelain doll, pale skin, the black, empty eyes, and the lips, stained with something dark. "It looks like blood." Daniel touched her face, and then the kitchen door slammed shut by itself. We ran into the hallway. The whole house groaned, as if something was waking up, and then, from the top of the stairs, footsteps, slow, heavy, and a voice whispered, low, scratched, "You're back." My body froze. The steps creaked. Daniel shined the flashlight, and for an instant, we saw it. A woman standing at the top of the stairs, a long white dress. Her hair was streaming down her face. Her arms were hanging at her sides. And then, she smiled. My heart stopped. Daniel took a step back. The air felt colder. The smell of damp earth grew stronger. And when I blinked, she wasn't there anymore. "Let's get out of here," I whispered. But Daniel didn't answer. He was staring at an old mirror on the wall. The reflection showed the two of us. But there was someone else there, behind us. The woman. She wasn't in the hallway, but she was in the reflection. And now, she wasn't smiling anymore. Daniel's flashlight flickered. The glass in the mirror cracked on its own. And then, in the darkness, her voice echoed again. "Why are you back?" That was the last thing we heard before the lights went out, and the mansion closed in around us. The darkness swallowed us. Daniel's flashlight went out. The hallway became an absolute void, and, in that suffocating silence, we heard it. Footsteps, slow, slow, coming down the stairs, coming towards us. My heart was beating so hard it hurt. The only thing that lit up the room was the cracked mirror. The reflection still showed her, the woman in the white dress, getting closer and closer. But when we looked back, the hallway was empty. "Daniel." My voice was just a whisper. He didn't answer. The flashlight flickered again, and then he screamed. I turned around in time to see him being pulled away. His hands were scratching the floor, but something invisible was dragging him into a dark room. "What is this?" He kicked, struggled, and then the door slammed shut by itself. I ran. I pulled the handle. It wouldn't open. "Daniel." I knocked on the door. Silence, and then her laughter, low, inside the room. My chest burned. My fingers hurt from pulling the handle so much. The wood was cold. That's when I saw the mirror in the hallway changed. Now, I saw Daniel inside, trapped in the reflection. He was knocking on the other dimension of the glass. He looked at me desperately, and behind him, the woman, closer and closer, the pale hand on his shoulder. And then, he screamed again. The glass shattered. The pieces flew down the hallway, and her voice whispered in my ear, "He belongs to the house now, too." I threw myself against the door. It swung open. The darkness dissipated, The room was empty. Daniel wasn't there anymore. The only thing on the floor was his flashlight, shaking. I picked it up. The light flickered, and then I saw it. On the wooden floor there were footprints, many, small, as if dozens of people had walked through it, and among them, a single word written in dust. Stay. I ran through the hallways. The mansion looked different. The covered furniture shifted. The shadows seemed to move. And then, the grandfather clock rang. 3 chimes, just like before. And this time, the front door was closed. I pulled on the doorknob with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. And then I felt it. Behind me, the presence, the cold breath, and then, the whisper. You are back. The floor creaked. The furniture shook, and I turned against my will. She was there, pale, tall, white dress, stained. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, there were others, faceless shadows, black eyes, wrong smiles, and in the middle of them, Daniel. His eyes were empty. His face was pale. His mouth was half open. He saw me and whispered, "Run." But before I could react, the house shook. The doors opened by themselves, and the darkness swallowed me. I woke up outside. The cold wind cut my face. Sour castle. Now it seemed empty again, but I knew the truth. It is never empty. It never was. Daniel was never found. The police found my backpack, my flashlight, and nothing else. But sometimes, I dream about him, and in my dream, he is still in the house, looking in the mirror, trapped in the shadows, and when I wake up, the reflection in my mirror smiles to myself. I never believed in ghosts until I went to the University of Kansas, and I had the worst night of my life. It all started as a stupid joke. My friends Mark and Ashley and I were drinking in the dorm when the conversation took a turn. "Have you guys heard about the Spooner Hall girl?" Mark asked, smirking. Ashley laughed. "Oh, that story about the student who died in the dorm. Everyone's heard it." But Mark shook his head. "It's not just that. They say that if you knock 3 times on the door of room 319, the door opens by itself. And if you go in, she appears." I laughed. It was just another college legend. But then, Mark threw down the gauntlet. "You guys don't have the guts to go there right now." Ashley hesitated, but I accepted. Spooner Hall was on the old side of campus, a tall, weathered stone building. The windows reflected only darkness. The place felt colder than the rest of campus, as if the building itself didn't want to be visited. But we went in anyway. The hallway was empty. The dim lights flickered occasionally. The walls were lined with old photos, the faces of students from the past, all staring at us. And then, we arrived at room 319. The door looked older than the others, and for some reason, it was slightly ajar. Ashley grabbed my arm. "Maybe it's best not to," but Mark was already knocking. Once, twice, 3 times, and then, the door opened by itself. The darkness inside was profound. The smell of dust and mold filled my nostrils. Mark laughed. "It's just the wind." But there were no open windows, and there was no wind. We walked in slowly. The flashlight on my phone illuminated old walls and dust-covered furniture, an iron bed, a table with dusty books, and on the floor, footprints, small ones, as if someone had walked barefoot there. Ashley whispered, "Let's go." But before we could leave, the door closed by itself. Mark tried to open it, locked. Panic rose in my chest. Ashley held my hand tightly, and then, the laughter started, low, coming from the corner of the room. My heart stopped. The flashlight illuminated the corner, and then we saw it, a shadow lying on the bed. The sheet rose and fell, as if someone was breathing there. My fingers froze. Mark tried to laugh, but his voice faltered. Is this some kind of prank?" Then the sheet fell to the floor by itself, and there was no one there. The silence was unbearable, until the laughter came back. This time, behind us. Ashley screamed. We turned at the same time, and then the closet door opened by itself. The darkness inside seemed solid, and in the middle of it, two hands appeared, skinny, pale. The fingers were too long, and then a girl came out of the closet. She was small. She was wearing an old white dress. Dark hair fell over her face, and her eyes, they had no color. They were just two dark holes. And then she whispered, low, cold, "You're back." Ashley ran to the door, trying to open it. Mark was shaking, but I couldn't move, because the girl was staring at me. Her pale face tilted up slowly, and then she smiled, but it was the wrong smile, too wide, as if her skin was tearing. And then she moved too fast, stopping right in front of me. My vision went black. My ears rang. Her voice whispered inside my head, low, slurred, "You've been here before." Something tugged at me, as if invisible hands were holding me down. My legs were pinned to the ground, and the girl, she grabbed my wrist. Her skin was cold as ice, and then the pain started. My veins burned, as if something was running down my body. Ashley screamed. Mark tried to pull me away, and then I felt it. I felt something inside me, something that shouldn't be there. And then the girl whispered, "Now you're part of the house too." And everything went dark. I woke up outside Spooner Hall. Mark and Ashley were beside me. The sun was already rising over the horizon. But I knew that wasn't a dream. My wrist was still burning. I rolled up my sleeve, and my blood ran cold, because engraved on my skin, there was a number, 319. I never went into that building again. We never spoke about that night again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my room, the number 319 still burns into my skin. And I swear that sometimes, in the dark, I hear that laugh, waiting. I should have never come back. After that night at Spooner Hall, I tried to forget, but some things don't let you forget. The number 319 still burned into my wrist. The skin never healed. And every night, I heard her laugh. Software too close. And then, my bedroom door started opening by itself. I locked it, but at 3:19 in the morning, it opened, always slowly, always creaking, and in the dark of the hallway, I saw it, a shadow standing still, watching, never entering, and yet, I felt it. It was getting closer and closer. Mark and Ashley avoided talking about it, until one night, Mark knocked on my door. His eyes were sunken, his face pale. She appeared to me. My stomach churned. "What?" He swallowed hard. "Yesterday, in my room, in the mirror." His skin was trembling. She was behind me. My breath hitched. I wasn't alone in this. Ashley arrived minutes later. She looked at us in shock. "What happened to you is happening to me too." She showed us her arms. The skin was marked, as if cold fingers had grabbed hold. And then, she said something that made me freeze. I hear her, in my room. Spooner Hall hadn't let us out. He'd brought us with him. And that night, we knew we had to go back, to end this. 3 a.m., Spooner Hall was dark. The cold wind blew through the broken windows. The hallway lights flickered dimly. And then, we reached room 319. The door was open, as if it had been waiting for us. We walked in slowly. The air was heavy. The mirror was cracked. The bed was still messy. And then, the door closed behind us. Alone. Panic rose in my throat. "Now what do we do?" Mark whispered. And that was when the whispers began, coming from the walls, from the corners of the ceiling, from inside the closet, and finally, from the mirror. The glass shook, the cracks spread, and in the reflection, we saw it. She was there, pale, eyes black, her mouth opened as if she were screaming without sound. And then, she stepped out of the mirror. Ashley screamed. Mark fell back, but I couldn't move. Her eyes were fixed on mine, and then she smiled, the same wrong smile, and whispered, "You're back." My skin burned. The number 319 pulsed on my arm, and then the lights went out. There was only darkness, and the sound of footsteps surrounding us, slow, shuffling. But it wasn't just hers. There were others, many others. An invisible force threw me against the wall. My head spun. Ashley sobbed. Mark tried to hold the door, but then the mirror exploded, and for a second, I saw faces trapped in the shattered glass, sunset eyes, hands trying to get out, students like us, and a whisper, "Stay with us." My heart nearly stopped. We had to get out of there. I grabbed Ashley by the arm. I pulled Mark away from the door. She tried to stop us. Her cold hands touched my face, but I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I screamed with everything inside me. "You won't take us!" The whole room shook. Her shadow vanished. The whisper dissolved. The door opened, and we ran. We left Spooner Hall without looking back. The moon lit up the campus. The night was almost still, but I knew it wasn't the end, because as we walked across the lawn, the windows of room 319 still reflected something, and in the cracked glass, she was still there, watching, waiting, because Spooner Hall never lets anyone go. Some stories should never be investigated, but that night, I ignored that warning, and I almost didn't come back to tell them. The Holloway farm was on the outskirts of Atchison, Kansas, an abandoned property, forgotten in time. They say that decades ago, the entire family was killed there. No one knew who did it. No one found the bodies. But the neighbors, they claimed that when night fell, the voices still echoed across the fields. And sometimes, the lights in the house would turn on by themselves. It was just another legend. At least that's what I thought, until I accepted the challenge of going inside. 2 in the morning. The field was covered in a thin fog. The moon barely illuminated the path. My flashlight wavered in my trembling hand, and there, in the middle of it all, the house, tall, falling apart. The windows were dark as empty eyes. The porch swing still moved, but there was no wind. There was never any wind. I took a deep breath. The wooden fence was rotten. I jumped down and followed the dirt path. My footsteps were the only sound, until they weren't anymore. Something moved in the cornfield next door, a soft rustle, slow, as if someone was watching me. My breathing became heavy, but I followed. The door to the house was open, as if inviting me in, and I did. The smell of old wood and wet earth filled my nose. The floor creaked under my weight. The hallway was narrow. Old photos still hung on the wall, and all of them were face down. My chest tightened. I moved on. The kitchen was intact, but the plates on the table still had food leftovers, rotting, as if someone had left in the middle of dinner and never returned. The silence suffocated me until I heard a cry, low, coming from upstairs, and, against all survival instincts, I went upstairs. The steps creaked. The door at the end of the hallway was ajar. The crying was coming from there. My heart was beating against my chest. I touched the wood, and the door opened by itself. The room was small, an old bed, a stained mirror, and, in the middle of the floor, a child kneeling, her hair falling over her face. Her body trembled. She was sobbing softly. Then, I smelled a strong odor. Blood. My body froze. "Hey," my voice came out weak. The child stopped crying. The silence was unbearable. And then, she raised her head, and my blood ran cold. Her face wasn't human. Skin too stretched. Her eyes, black as coal. Her mouth opened slowly, too big. And then, she smiled. My feet moved before my mind. I ran down the hallway. The pictures fell from the walls. The doors slammed shut on their own. The air became suffocating. The girl's crying turned to laughter, and when I looked back, she was no longer there, but the laughter still echoed around me. I ran down the stairs, but the house had changed. The furniture was no longer in the same place. The front door was gone. I turned around in despair, and then I saw it. In the dark hallway, a tall shadow, the same black, empty face, but now it was a man. He leaned in and whispered something that made me freeze. "You shouldn't be here." My lungs burned. Time seemed distorted, but when I blinked, the house was normal again. The front door was open. The silence, deep. Without thinking, I ran outside. I crossed the fence and only stopped when the farm was behind me. The next day, no one believed me. But the worst was what happened that night. I woke up with a weight on my chest. My eyes opened slowly. The darkness of my room seemed denser. Then, I heard the rustling of the cornfield outside my window, slow, as if someone was there, listening, waiting, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw the same smile, pale, black eyes, and a cold whisper inside my head. "The house never lets anyone go. The house never lets anyone go." I should have forgotten those words, but the next night, the farm came to me. I woke up with a weight on my chest, the feeling that someone was watching me. My mouth was dry, my skin was cold, and then I heard it, low, slow, the rustling of the cornfield. Inside my room, I turned slowly. The light from the street lamp came through the window, but something was wrong. The shadows moved, they writhed, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw it. The man from the farm, the empty face, the eyes as black as night, the same wrong smile. He was looking at me, on the other side of the glass, but I was on the second floor. There was no way he could be there. And then, he knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. My throat caught. I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them again, nothing. The window was empty, but something inside me knew this wasn't over. The next day, I decided to go back to the farm. I needed answers. I got in the car and drove to Atchison. The road seemed longer. Fog covered the fields, and when I pulled up in front of the house, it seemed to be waiting for me. The door was still open. The table was still set, but there was something different. On the wooden floor, a mark, a design carved into the floor, a circle with strange symbols around it, as if someone had performed a ritual there. And in the center, there were names scratched into the wood. My heart raced because the last name was mine. A chill crept up my spine. The air seemed thicker, and then I heard footsteps, shuffling, heavy, coming from upstairs. My breath caught. The steps creaked on their own. I didn't want to look, but I did. And there he was, the man from the farm, standing at the top of the stairs. His eyes were dark as death. His smile was wide, and this time, he spoke. "You're back." The sound came from inside my head. My vision went black. My body felt heavy. And then, I fell to my knees. The walls shook. The air smelled of damp earth. And suddenly, the voices began, low, multiple, whispering, calling my name. And between the whispers, I heard, "You belong to the house now." My hands shook. My skin burned. The ground seemed to open up beneath me. And the man from the farm, he stepped down a step, then another, and another, coming straight toward me, until someone pulled me back. The air rushed into my lungs. My eyes flew open. I was no longer in the house. I was outside. The sun was already rising, and before me, the farm was different, old, worn out, but empty. There was no furniture left inside. The door was no longer open, and the circle, gone. It was like it had never been there. But I knew the truth. The house tried to keep me there, but something, or someone, brought me back, and I never found out what. I went back to the city. I tried to move on with my life, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear it, the rustling of the cornfield, the sound of footsteps, and when I look out the window, for a second, I think I see it, his silhouette, still waiting, because the farm may have let me go, but it still wants me to come back, and one day, I know I will.